This is a banknote from Senegal. Here is another from Congo. They look nothing like each other, yet they are part of the same scheme, a scheme that pegs both currencies to the euro, a rate determined by the French treasury. The issue at stake is the apex of French policymaking, the CFA franc. Using it, France controls the monetary sovereignty of 14 nations, making up nearly 200 million people. These countries include Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, and the Central African Republic. And while these nations have a seat at the United Nations and wave their independent flags, it is only the face of imperialism that has changed. The conduct of business has largely remained the same. The big difference is that imperialism used to be spread through tanks. Nowadays, it comes through banks.
It is high time for France to lift its knee off our neck and put an end to this unjust oppression. Centuries of misery, human trafficking, colonization, and neocolonization have caused immeasurable suffering. It's time to put an end to this cycle of oppression.
The American presence in the territory of the Republic of Niger is illegal. It violates all the constitutional and democratic rules.
The Burkina Faso government is kicking out the French troops. They actually gave them just 1 month to leave their country.
As far as what concerns Burkina Faso today, for more than 8 years we've been confronted with the most barbaric and the most violent form of imperialist neocolonialism. Slavery continues to impose itself on us.
We asked the Americans to remove their soldiers from our country. We realized that they too are not serious.
These Western forces are coming to our country because it is full of uranium, diamond and gold resources. And these resources are untapped. These forces are at the origin of the arrival of terrorism in our country. These forces are at the origin of the arrival of terrorism in our country.
The United States has pumped more than $1 billion into this region, into military facilities and military programs, and supporting military elements in this region. In Niger alone, the United States has spent $500 million building a military base and military and drone facilities in Agadez to support French exploitation of the mineral human resources of Niger. The African peoples have been fighting for self-determination, have been calling for the unification of Africa. The African peoples have been calling for the African currency so that they are not sending billions of dollars, up to $48 billion every year to Western European countries. The African countries want freedom of movement. They're creating the Africa Continental Free Trade Community. The United States, France, the European Union, all foreign powers are against Africa uniting and creating roads and railways and ports for the African peoples. The overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya was directly related to the plan by the African Union for an African currency. An African currency that prevents the outflow of resources from Africa is a threat to France, the European Union, and the United States of America. And that is why the United States is creating the bogey.
Nigerians on the march again. They took to the streets last year to demand the withdrawal of French forces, and they succeeded. This time, they are protesting to demand the closure of US army bases in their country. The US has around 1,000 security personnel in Niger on a mission to fight armed groups in the Sahel region. But the protesters say that's not the reason why Washington has soldiers in their country.
These Western forces are coming to our country because it is full of uranium, diamond and gold resources.
Washington has not commented on the demands of the protesters, who say they will keep returning to the streets until the American soldiers leave Niger.
And so it continues. The United States is kicked out of another African country, this time Chad.
This is the latest in a series of stalemates, fiascos, and even outright defeats that have come to haunt America's so-called global war on terror on the African continent.
Chad's Air Force asked the U.S. Defense Attaché to immediately stop the U.S. activities at the Ajikose Air Base.
This development is key considering that this is the second country in the region to kick America out. In March of this year, the United States was forced to stop its military operations in Niger,
which would require the sovereign people, notably through its elected officials, to be consulted on the installation of a foreign army on its territory. The government of Niger, taking into account the aspirations and interests of its people, decides with full responsibility to denounce with immediate effect the agreement relating to the status of military personnel of the United States and civilian employees of the American Department of Defense in the territory of the Republic of Niger.
Spokesperson stating that the agreement is not only profoundly unfair in its essence, but it does not meet the aspirations and interests of the Nigerian people because, firstly, it forces Niger to pay bills related to taxes on American military aircraft, which must be paid regularly and which cost Nigerian taxpayers billions of CFA francs. Then the competent Nigerian authorities have no information on military activities carried out from American bases in Niger and are unaware of the civilian and military personnel as well as the American equipment deployed on the Nigerian soil.
The Russian Federation's narrative drowned out the U.S. government's in the past years. The Russian Federation stoked a lot of the instability across the Sahel. They did this through misinformation, disinformation campaigns. So I see how we could double down in our efforts is through our own information campaign. The Russian Federation wants to establish a ground game that resembles a state partnership program, but it doesn't have the values and doesn't have the values, the democratic values of what we bring, that is the intrinsic values for stability, security, and security.
The Burkina Faso government is kicking out the French troops. They actually gave them just 1 month to leave their country. It is going to affect the relationship between France and Burkina Faso, but I doubt that Burkina Faso cares that much about what France thinks about their decision because their relationship has not been good for a while now, especially after the military government took over.
If France was our partner, it was supposed to help us fight against terrorism. But since 2016, there has been no change. We think France doesn't deserve Burkina Faso's trust.
Now its military rulers have reportedly suspended the 2018 security accord with Paris.
It's like one by one, they're dropping France and they're saying, you have not been beneficial to us. If anything, we feel like there's even shady business going on behind the scenes. So you just leave our country. Clearly, they were not happy with Mali kicking them out. And as you know, they tried to drag Mali in the UN Security Council and they demanded for investigation.
This comes as West African leaders from ECOWAS are holding an emergency summit today in the Nigerian capital Abuja to determine their next steps after a deadline to restore ousted President Mohamed Bazoum passed Sunday. ECOWAS, backed by the U.S. and the former colonizer France, had threatened to use military force if their deadline was not met, but the U.S. and the former colonizer France had threatened to use military force if their deadline was not met. But neighbors Mali and Burkina Faso, all ruled by coup leaders who've ejected French forces from their country, have said any military action would be taken as an attack on their countries as well. Many Nigerians have been taking to the streets since July 26 coup to show their support of the military and voice opposition to any foreign intervention. On Wednesday, the coup leadership accused France of violating its airspace. Meanwhile, sanctions and power cuts imposed on Niger have hampered delivery of humanitarian aid to over 4 million people in need of assistance, according to the UN. African officers trained by the U.S. military have now taken part in 11 coups in West Africa since 2008, including in Burkina Faso and Mali.
The fabrication of terror, the intervention of the United States and France in the region, and the financing of groups, military groups in the region by France. The United States has pumped more than $1 billion into this region, into military facilities and military programs, and supporting military elements in this region. The foreign minister of Mali has called on the United Nations to investigate France in the region. And it is the right-wing conservative forces in the United States that is supporting France, to the point where now we see the conservative wing of the Biden administration, led by Victoria Nuland and Antony Blinken, leading the discussions on Africa. Why is it that Victoria Nuland was in Niger on Monday and Victoria Nuland is in South Africa? But is Victoria Nuland the hawk that wants to militarize the planet Earth, who is a rabid militarist, who is now flying between Nigeria, Niger, and South Africa, carrying out U.S. policies? The French are inordinately dependent on the exploitation and plunder of Africa. The French has military personnel in Niger. When their military personnel were thrown out of Mali and Burkina Faso, they were redeployed to Niger. The France has exploited the mineral and natural resources of Niger. The French uranium mines in Niger not only exploited the uranium resources of Niger, but France has also closed mines and left radioactive material that is deleterious to the health and safety of the Nigerian people. Now, everyone in West Africa is calling for the ending of the CFA franc and the domination of the economies of West Africa by France. They're calling for the removal of the 240,000 French personnel in West Africa to replenish Lake Chad. Who is against this? France. Who is against investment in reconstruction in West Africa? France. Who has been supporting, who allegedly has been supporting terror groups in West Africa when the United States called for investigation into Boko Haram? It was revealed in the Nigerian newspapers that the French has been supporting Boko Haram in Nigeria. So the French create terrorist groups and then goes into African countries to say they are fighting terrorism in Africa. This kind of duplicity by France and fomenting terror and destruction has been challenged by the peoples of West Africa. In every country in West Africa, they're calling for the ending of French economic, financial, and military domination. But the priority at this moment is for the removal of France and to call on the United Nations to have sanctions against France for its destruction and militarism in Africa.
Burkina Faso's interim leader, Ibrahim Traoré, who took power in a coup in September, recently spoke in Moscow during the Russia-African summit. He criticized what he called imperialist neocolonialism.
The questions my generation is asking are the following. If I can summarize, it is that we do not understand how Africa, with so much wealth on our soil, with generous nature, water, sunshine and abundance, how Africa is today the poorest continent. That because of this poverty, they are forced to cross the ocean to try to reach Europe. They die in the ocean, but soon they will no longer have to cross.
Thomas Sankara was a leader who organized the people of Burkina Faso to bring safety, security, sanitation, peace to that country, and it was about how to mobilize the people of West Africa against French imperialism. And through French and Ivorian machinations, Thomas Sankara was killed. Thomas Sankara was killed. The military in Burkina Faso still has some of the sentiment and consciousness of Thomas Sankara. But what was being said by the leader of Burkina Faso is now reflected all across West Africa. In Senegal, the anti-French, anti-imperialist sentiments are very high, and the highest anti-imperialist sentiment in Africa at the moment is to be found in the Sudan, where the revolution in the Sudan has mobilized the people into resistance committees.
The African officers who are involved in these 11 coups in the last 15 years in West Africa, including in Burkina Faso and Mali, have been trained in the United States.
That is why we need greater investigation in what the United States is doing in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, and to call for closing of the United States Africa Command.
It's time to put an end to this cycle of oppression. It's high time for France to leave us alone. On what grounds does France believe it can continue to impose leaders on us and make choices on our behalf? This must come to an end. And the emerging Africa, the African youth, the African elites, and the African diaspora all stand united in saying no, it cannot continue any longer. France's hypocrisy is evident and pervasive in daily life. Personally, we expect absolutely nothing from France. We desire her to cease meddling in our matters so that the people of Senegal can exercise their freedom of choice rather than being influenced by France's selection of a candidate using the tactics we are aware of. We begin by targeting individuals, adorning them with the Legion of Honor or a similar knightly rank, enlisting them in Masonic lodges, and informing them to prepare themselves as they will be next in line. It is crucial that we work together towards a future that is equitable, just, and environmentally conscious. If she listens, I believe we'll have beautiful days ahead in our collaboration together. If he doesn't know how to cut it, thinking he can continue to function like in the time of our grandfathers, this African youth no longer accepts it. France must make preparations for a definitive break and completely withdraw from Africa. Africa belongs to Africans, not France. She belongs to no one else, neither China, nor the United States, nor anyone else.
The unexpected victory of Senegal's new president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, sparked intense debates in France about the fate of its relationship with the former West African colony. During the presidential campaign, Bassirou Diomaye Diakhar Faye, who was newly elected as the president of Senegal, made a promise to completely sever all remaining ties with the country's former colonial power. In addition to this, he also announced his plans to discontinue the use of the CFA franc, which is the currency that is currently employed in the former French territories across West and Equatorial Africa. So, if you are wondering what the president has done so far since he was sworn in, let me shock you that all French companies operating within Senegal will henceforth pay their taxes to the Senegalese treasury rather than to France. Furthermore, President Faye has recently announced a comprehensive audit of Senegal's oil, gas, and mining sectors. During a recent televised address, he stated that this audit would be conducted with great scrutiny, examining every facet of these industries to ensure they are operating in accordance with the laws and regulations of the country. He has pledged to disclose the effective ownership of extractive companies and conduct a thorough audit of the mining, oil, and gas sector. This will help to ensure that these industries operate in a transparent and sustainable manner, and that the benefits of their operations are shared equitably among the people of Senegal. It is clear that France is no longer at ease in Africa, and its heinous actions are finally being exposed for the world to see. In the 1960s, France granted independence to its African colonies, but the terms of independence were punitive and designed to ensure French control over the newly independent states. President de Gaulle of France imposed puppet leaders as new rulers of these so-called independent countries. These leaders were handpicked by France to take care of French interests instead of the interests of their countries. The leaders installed in these countries included Léopold Senghor of Senegal, Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, Amadou Ahidjo of Cameroons, Maurice Yameogo of the then Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, Amani Diori of Niger, Hubert Maga of the then Dahomey, now Benin, Tombal Baye of Chad, Jean Bokassa of Central African Republic, and other pliable leaders. The puppet leaders installed by France were chosen for their loyalty to France and their willingness to maintain the status quo. They were mostly French people in black skin who wholly imbibed French culture. These leaders could see nothing wrong with France and were only interested in serving French interests. They were not interested in the welfare of their own people. To ensure compliance with the terms of independence, France kept paratroopers in these former colonies at independence for the purpose of ousting any recalcitrant leader. All the foreign exchange earnings of these countries were domiciled in Paris, where they were linked to French franc. The countries could only withdraw their legitimate earnings with the permission of the French government. It is therefore gratifying to learn that by July this year, 8 former French colonies in Africa will stop using CFA and adopt their own independent currency called ECO. The ECO will be tied to the euro instead of the French franc, a move that has been welcomed by many. However, it is unfortunate that the youthful French president, Emmanuel Macron, seems to be oblivious to the handwriting on the wall. Instead of initiating new French-African policy based on collaboration between equal partners, he is still pursuing the imperious policy of the de Gaulle era, which many consider archaic and subjugating. This policy is now roundly rejected by leaders in French former colonies in Africa. In his reaction to the new development, Macron has been accused of arrogance due to his assertion that Niger and other Sahel countries would collapse without French support. This statement has been seen as a continuation of the old French policy of treating African countries as dependent rather than equal partners. It is important to note that the policy of France towards its former colonies in Africa contradicts the French motto of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Waving Malian flags, thousands gathered in Mali's capital, Bamako, to protest against the former colonial power, France. There was even a cardboard cutout of French President Emmanuel Macron. The demonstration happening on the same day he was sanctioned by the EU for his role in the coup. The measures include travel bans and asset freezes and target 5 people, including the transitional Prime Minister, Choguel Maïga, and members of interim President Assimi Goïta's inner circle. Relations with the EU have soured since Goïta put himself in charge. But Diarra described the sanctions as an honour, saying expelling the French ambassador is only the latest step in getting rid of Paris's influence.
It's an important step in the fight, but the victory must go all the way. The next step must be the departure of French forces, and then we will start the move towards economic and monetary sovereignty.
There are about 5,000 foreign troops in Mali, deployed to contain years of insecurity in the north. They include missions from France, the wider EU, and the United Nations.
We don't want any foreign troops in Mali. They've been here for 8 years now, and nothing has changed.
Imperialism used to be spread through tanks. Nowadays, it comes through banks. Paris sought to monopolize these circuits of production and trade. Taxes were demanded in francs, and armed troops were sent to markets, forcing merchants to accept French currency. From the 1930s onwards, France came to dominate the money supply in French-speaking Africa. With new power came new extrajudicial perks. Paris gained access to African labor and raw materials at sub-market prices. while finished goods were sold back to Africa at above market prices. French neo-colonialism was so intrusive, so ruthless, so unique that it earned a name of its own, France-Afrique. Following World War II, however, things changed. Paris joined the Bretton Woods system, and as a result, the French franc was devalued to set a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. These fiscal reforms were taking place at a time when Africa was decolonizing itself. A weaker currency only added fuel to the fire. So, to hold on to its African holdings, France conjured a new currency in 1945 called the CFA franc and forced its colonies to adopt it. Initially, the CFA franc was pegged to its French counterpart at a rate of 1.7 to 1, but in 1948 it was increased to 2 to 1. By overvaluing the CFA franc, Paris maintained its economic advantage while crushing Africa's export competitiveness. So in a way, France built its post-war recovery partially to a wealth transfer from Africa. Even so, the most effective forms of control are those that are invisible. Recognizing this in 1958, France hijacked authentic decolonization by installing local collaborators and granting them statehood. These collaborators became the custodians of France's neo-colonial empire by maintaining the franc zone and French military bases. Only Guinea turned down the offer. Its leader, Sékou Touré, declared that his people preferred being poor in freedom than rich in slavery. Guinea thus rejected the CFA franc, seeking to develop its own currency. France felt it needed to make an example of Guinea, so it cut pensions to war veterans, dismantled Guinea's power grid, and then attempted to block its UN membership. France went as far as to induce hyperinflation by flooding the country with counterfeit bills, all the while funding armed anti-government resistance. Yeah, it got pretty crazy. The plan ultimately failed to dislodge Sékou Touré, but Guinea's economy never fully recovered. Likewise, when Togo had a change of heart and sought to ditch the CFA franc, France made another example, this time without loose ends. Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was assassinated in January 1963. French involvement is suspected, but official records remain conveniently closed. Of itself, further attempts to conceal French imperialism followed. The CFA franc was split into two currencies covering the Central and West African states. By the mid-1970s, their respective central banks were Africanized and moved to Yaoundé and Dakar. Though local Africans staffed these institutions, there were no fundamental policy changes, and France retained veto power over the banks' governing statutes. This included a requirement that member states deposit half their exchange reserves at the French treasury, plus another 20% for financial liabilities, meaning member states retained access only to 30% of their money. Moreover, all foreign exchange conversions were to pass through the French treasury. The way this fiscal policy works is by operations accounts. These are special accounts held at the French treasury. The denominations are in euros, but when accounts are in credit, the African central banks effectively place their foreign exchange reserves at France's disposal. But when the central banks' accounts are in debit, they are obligated to pay interest to the French treasury. In other words, CFA member states pay France to hold on to their money. Even more unsettling, no one knows what France does with the money. The French treasury does not disclose this information even to CFA franc nations. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary if France were to reinvest African funding for French profit. However, one looks at it, the CFA scheme is an effective moneymaker for France, and French businesses benefit as much as the French treasury. More specifically, France doesn't need to draw on its foreign exchange reserves for African imports. Dozens of French multinationals are present in Africa, including Total Energies, Areva, and Vinci. Africa also grants France access to strategic resources like uranium, which is indispensable for France's nuclear energy sector, meeting 3/4 of French energy needs. Meanwhile, Gabon is a source of crude oil, Mauritania delivers iron ore, while Togo and Benin provide agricultural commodities. Additionally, the icing on the cake, French national Vincent Bolloré owns most of West Africa's major ports. It is thus not by incident that former French President Jacques Chirac once stated that much of the money in French banks comes precisely from exploiting Africa, and that France would lose its global standing without its African empire. To preserve its hegemony, France has intervened militarily on the continent 40 times since the 1960s, from propping up corrupt dictators to conducting military operations in the Sahel. Moreover, the configurations of the CFA franc allow profits and capital to be repatriated with ease. Between 1970 and 2010, Ivory Coast lost $40 billion to capital flight, which could have reduced poverty by 10% annually had it been reinvested domestically. Meanwhile, Equatorial Guinea and Congo, the main oil producers, transferred out the money equivalent of 43% and 30% of their respective GDPs between 2000 and 2009. Similar trends are present in Gabon and Cameroon. Opulence at the top generates misery below. Though advocates point to the CFA franc's stability, a lack of monetary sovereignty restricts the tools available to the CFA member states. For instance, Ivory Coast's inflation rate is below 6% versus 29% in neighboring Ghana, but the latter's extreme poverty rate is only 13% versus 30% of Ivorians. The CFA member states also lag behind other African states growth-wise. Some are even going backwards. Ivory Coast's real GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than in 1978. In 2016, Senegal was at its 1960 level. Meanwhile, Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon have not topped their respective peaks of 1986, 1984, and 1976. This means these countries have had little to no real economic growth in decades. But change is the only constant in life. In recent years, the societies of the CFA member states have started publicly talking about alternatives. It's a trend that is becoming increasingly louder. The most feasible proposal is to form a regional currency bloc untethered from French control. Some proponents of this plan would use the West African ECOWAS economic union as a springboard. This would reorient the CFA franc member states around Nigeria, which accounts for more than 2/3 of the regional GDP. Plus, Nigeria is a net oil exporter, while most West African states are importers, so there is a natural synergy in the ECOWAS region. Of course, nothing worth having comes easy. Paris has sought to forestall these attempts. A law to this effect was passed in the French Senate in January 2021. It looks to change the West African CFA franc into the ECO, and then abolish the operations accounts and withdraw French personnel from the central banks. All this is to be completed by 2027, but Paris would still retain effective control. Where the African monetary reserves would be held, at which location remains unaddressed. It's safe to say that the French reform is nothing but a ruse. Ultimately, the best solution may be for the individual states to have their own central banks and currencies, fixed to a common regional unit at an adjustable rate. This would give monetary sovereignty to 14 nations, or nearly 200 million people. Any attempts to break away from French hegemony would require a joint effort across the CFA franc zone. Most of all, the African collaborating elites who benefit from the system would need to be sidelined and replaced by lawmakers prepared to embark on a path of self-directed development.
about the small things.